something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today I'm going to be speaking with Jim DiEugenio. Jim is one of the most respected, prolific, and indefatigable researchers and writers on the political assassinations of the 1960s, especially the JFK assassination. He's the author of two books, Destiny Betrayed and The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today. With Oliver Stone, Jim is also the co-author of JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass. And he is the co-editor of The Assassinations. For many years, Jim DiEugenio has made regular appearances on Leno Sanek's Black Op Radio podcast. His newest book is a volume that he edited and contributed to entitled Chokeholds, or the JFK Assassination Chokeholds that Prove There Was a Conspiracy. Today, Jim and I are going to be talking about the Trump administration's release of many illegally withheld JFK-related documents, as well as Jim's congressional appearance with Oliver Stone and Jefferson Morley to discuss the JFK case in front of Representative Luna's committee. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. Today's episode is free, but if you appreciate serious, deep political research and analysis, consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have over 200 episodes and counting for people who want to better understand things like the JFK assassination, as well as other aspects of the deep history of the U.S. empire. American Exception is the place to go. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Jim DiEugenio, it's great to have you back.
Nice to be here, Aaron.
So you have recently been in front of Congress talking about the JFK assassination, which I wonder if you ever thought that day would come. It's pretty amazing knowing the arc of your work and the amount of time you put into it and the way you've looked back at the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on assassinations and the books you've written and the film with Oliver, and now you're there in front of Congress. What are your reflections on that at this time? You know, a few weeks out now, and is there any update on related things in the future?
To answer the first question, no, I never believed something like this would happen. Okay, and on top of that, to have that three-person panel there, me, Oliver Stone, and Jeff Morley, was really something. You know, when you consider the history of the JFK case, you know, you usually get people like Arlen Specter, David Mellon, Gerald Ford, you know, Robert Blakey, etc. Those are usually the kind of people that you get, you know, talking about the JFK case before Congress. But here you had, you know, the maker of JFK, the writer of several books, including one on Jim Garrison, and Jeff Morley, you know, of JFK Facts, you know, speaking before Congress. And it went on for over 2.5 hours. All right. So it was really, I wrote about this on my Substack, and it was apparently because Luna, the chairperson of the committee, Anna Luna, is doing this exploration of these 7 events, you know, that have had a strong impact on American history, you know, and she included all 3 assassinations. Okay. And, some of the other ones were about Jeff Epstein, 9/11, and the UFO phenomenon. All right. But she led off, I believe, very wisely with the JFK case, figuring that will get the most press attention, which it did. And by the way, that hearing just on one platform on YouTube, the Forbes, the business magazine,
No,
that
the
got
loose one.
1.7 million. 1.7 million views on just that one platform. Okay. So I imagine, if you add up all the platforms, and I imagine, a few million people have seen the thing.
Yeah.
And then if you add up the appearances that Oliver and myself and Jeff made on television the next couple of days, that I believe really had an impact. I really believe it had an impact. All right. So it was an interesting experience. And a couple of the highlights were that when me and Oliver flew in from Washington, the congressional liaison, the staffer on the committee, a guy named Jake, we met him at the Rayburn building, which houses the offices of the House Representatives, named after the legendary speaker Sam Rayburn. And he escorted us down to Luna's office. All right. I thought this was just going to be me, Jeff, Luna, Oliver, and Jake. That's what I thought it was going to be. I walked into the office and it was packed. It was standing room only in her office. There were all these people. There were two other people from the committee there. Okay. And they were there. Their staffers were there. There must have been 11 or 12 people in this preparatory meeting, and this should have told me something because they were all Republicans. When we got to the actual meeting the next day, the hearing the next day, it was the Republicans who were there. Every single Republican was there, and they stayed for a while. Whereas there were only 4 Democrats there. And they didn't stay the whole time. And they were not really interested in the JFK case. And in fact, Robert Garcia, who I believe was the Democratic lead on the committee, he asked Jeff Morley more than once, what is your direct evidence that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination? And something, I really should have interrupted because Jeff never said this, which I think would have been the best answer. This is what I would have said. And it would have been right up his alley. Okay. I would have said, Mr. Garcia, when the church committee investigated the performance of the intelligence community in service of the Warren Commission, one of the witnesses they brought in was James Angleton. Angleton was in executive session, but when he came out, he was asked a question about the Kennedy case by a reporter. And he replied with one of the most curious, one of the most suspicious comments that any CIA official has ever made. He said, a mansion has many rooms. I was not privy to who struck John. Now that, of course, that comment is freighted with import. But then it was topped later when Victor Marchetti wrote that the CIA was going to hang out Howard Hunt for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And Mark Lane entered that case when Hunt sued Spotlight, where Marchetti had written this. And he had to come up with some evidence that such was the case. And he searched high and low. And he finally found somebody who said they had seen this memo about hanging Howard Hunt out to dry. And it was Joseph.
Joe Trento. Okay.
Joseph Trento.
Yeah. I knew about Trento, but I was like, is there another person between Trento and okay? Yeah, and Trento's a strange guy. He's an Angleton friendly
Trento
person.
said that he saw the memo. And Lane asked him, what did it say? It said it was Angleton to Helms, and it said, we have to devise an alibi for Howard Hunt being in Dallas on the day of the Kennedy assassination. And Lane said, well, what do you think he was doing? What do you think it meant? And Trento said, knowing James Angleton, he was trying to tell Helms that, look, I'm not going to be the fall guy on this. Okay, if I go down on this, I'm bringing you with me. Okay?
Yeah, because that sort of a memo is exactly the kind of thing Angleton would not have left a paper trail of unless it was to suit his designs. I mean, after looking at the things that he did with the Cuban business and so on, like that's a very, there are a lot of implications to that whole story.
It turned out that Angleton showed it to Trento.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, if I would have been answering that question, that's what I would have said. And then I would have closed by saying, you know something, Trey Gowdy is not on this committee, but if he was, he would say that that's consciousness of guilt. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that was a fascinating story. It did seem it wasn't really just about Hunt. It was Hunt and Angleton, and they
right.
I think that it was up in the air what they were going to do in the 70s. I think there were some people who I think wanted to blame this perhaps on Angleton and his part of the CIA, but as you say, and as I found when I looked at that church committee testimony, all of Angleton's activities seem to have been ultimately Helms is the guy who was privy to them. He was privy to the fact that they were about using the Israeli officer as the go-between in Cuba, and it was Helms and Harvey who decided not to brief McCone on the mob assassination plots and such. It was those guys seem guilty as can be when you look back at all this.
See, Helms was a very clever operator. Okay, because if you take a look at Watergate, Helms knew the duty officer called him at 4:00 in the morning, okay, and said, McCord has been captured, okay, at the Watergate Hotel. And somehow Helms wasn't surprised, okay, and he made some very interesting comments on the phone that night, and McCord then said that very threatening letter, all right, to, I think it was Caulfield, Jack Caulfield.
Yeah.
All right. Is it either Caulfield or Ulasewicz?
No, I think that it's Caulfield.
It was Caulfield? Okay.
I think.
Because Caulfield made the offer to him of immunity. Okay. That you'll only, well, it wasn't quite immunity. You only get a few months in jail. We'll take care of all your things. And he turned it down. And he said, look, if Helms is dismissed and the blame is placed on CIA, every tree in the forest will fall. It will be a scorched earth policy. Things are at the precipice right now. If they keep on going as they are, that is what is going to happen. Sort of like something like that.
Right.
And so here you have Helms, right at the middle of this Watergate thing, okay, Don't blame it on the CIA. All right. And then you have Angleton more or less threatening Helms, okay, over the JFK case. Don't think I'm going to take the fall for this, okay, because I'm not. Okay.
It may be deeper than that, Jim, because I have a article Peter. It's really Peter's article. I added a little bit to it and edited it to it. He was too old. He kind of was maybe didn't want to finish it because it was so dense at his advanced age. And so it talks about how immediately with Watergate, it's like Helms is caught flat-footed to some degree as well because of aspects of the burglars' backgrounds. Because of it basically it traces to these Mexican banks, and these Mexican banks are connected to people that they have been using. People like Harold Meltzer, Happy Meltzer, who was the person who set up the Mexican heroin connection that really Lansky was the reason Lansky created Las Vegas. The city of Las Vegas was really meant to deal with that new drug connection that was set up because of the post World War II or the World War II disruption of drug lines, right? But it's connected to CIA actors as well. And so this is why Helms initially says like, oh, well, yeah, we want to cover some of this up because it actually Watergate really exposed part of the CIA because they were involved in all of this. The Watergate burglars were probably put together by Angleton, and I've talked about this with Jim Hogan and others.
Didn't Nixon want to use that Mexican bank thing? I think he wanted to use it against the CIA.
That would probably be That's about what he was. That's about what Nick is implied with Nixon's. He says it's going to get into some of this Cuban business and such.
Right, yeah.
Which when you read about what that really was, and you do have the Lansky angle.
And wait a minute. Didn't Helms actually go along with that temporarily?
Yeah.
He actually went along
for a
with
little.
That.
Yeah, he did. He did for a few weeks, and they can hide a lot in a couple of weeks, I would say. So it's like I don't even know that. I think in that case, it may have been similar to what we're talking about with the Trento memo. That Angleton knows that Helms is compromised to a degree because of all the things that they relied on Angleton's connections to do and the things that they set up.
Aaron, the thing is, I'm sure you read the book, right? Plausible Denial.
Yeah, a long time ago, but yeah.
But the thing is, Hunt couldn't prove that he wasn't in Dallas.
Yeah.
He wasn't in Washington at his home, right. Or Virginia or something like that. Okay, and so Lane ended up winning the trial.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the Angleton memo wasn't just a threat. Maybe it wasn't just I'm hanging this over your head. Maybe Hunt really was in Dallas. Okay, and then it would be unexplainable unless he had some kind of alibi, for being there. So I always thought, I don't know why Jeff didn't use that. Okay, but that's what I would have said if somebody would have challenged me as to the direct evidence. I said, I don't see how you get much more direct than that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the annoying thing about that question is, and this is something that Lance dealt with when he sort of hashed out some of the administrative implications of state crimes against democracy, is that you're talking about cases where the state or the regime, however you want to think of it, is the most likely suspect and is also in charge of the investigation, which means it's problematic from the very beginning. So when you're saying direct evidence of this, well, the main suspect is the person who collected all the direct evidence as you would and evaluated it or disappeared it, like the president's brain.
Right.
So it's like the state steals the brain, and then the guy's saying like, how come you don't have any evidence? Well, we think the state did it, and we sure would like to see the brain, but the state lost it. Yeah. I mean, what do you even say about that?
Right. Well, see that that's what it's an old axiom of criminal behavior that you don't have to commit the perfect crime. You just have to control the cover-up.
Yeah.
Okay? All right. Who needs a perfect crime? It's when you're in charge of the cover-up, you can get away with everything. And that's actually did what happened, in both. Well, let's see. I would say in all three cases.
Yeah.
The JFK, RFK, and MLK. I think that was the case in all of them. In the King case, you had Percy Foreman essentially selling his client down the river. In the Robert Kennedy case, you had those two guys, Pena and Hernandez, who used to work for the CIA, now come in and they manage a special unit senator. And in the Kennedy case, you had Alan Dulles, who was the most active member of the Warren Commission, and Helms then makes Angleton the liaison between the Warren Commission and the CIA.
Only after the other guy was
right. You're right. Exactly.
And what
Go
was
ahead.
that? What was that guy's name? Skelso was the alias, and then Whitten.
It was Whitten.
Yeah, and you know what else he said? This is something else that he is in one of his testimony into the church committee. He says that at one point RFK tasked him to investigate the Las Vegas skim, and that Lansky was, taking out of the casinos and using, internationally, and it was going into these Panamanian banks. And RFK tasked Whitten to look into this, and he thought, yeah, this would be a good thing to look into. So somebody says, well, no, you better go run that by Angleton. And Angleton says, no, you can't do that. That would be the FBI's responsibility, and it's not ours, right?
I never heard that one before.
Yeah, so
that's really interesting.
But this is because Angleton was, in the Cuban business and such, he was running these guys with part of these assassination units.
No, I didn't know Bobby ever requested that.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting story, that he was onto something like that.
Yeah, he was. And Bobby Kennedy's actions against the mob and the drug policy, and I've heard you talk about this too, in terms of the sort of black holes that the media won't go into, JFK assassination and drug traffic. And when you look at what happened with the post-war drug traffic and the way that Lansky gets, and people that are aligned with him get adopted or absorbed by the national security state. Harry Truman gave Lansky the Medal of Freedom. Like it's amazing how corrupt it was. Like he gave him the Medal of Freedom. They took over the National Wire Service. That's probably why they killed Bugsy Siegel. He's protected
that was one of the reasons. That was one of the reasons. Yes.
Yeah. And Lansky is the person really running the syndicate because he's the money launderer, and he has the fix with the government. That's sort of what Bobby was getting at. Bobby wasn't looking at this Italian mob thing that Hoover and the FBN were trying to say, because Hoover and the FBN were basically protecting Lansky. They wouldn't allow Lansky to be wiretapped. It was, I think the mob and the national security state were intertwined, beginning with Operation Overworld, and the CIA just works with drug traffickers, and that's part of what compromised them so much. And this is
they eventually got into drug trafficking themselves.
More or less, yeah. They were so direct about it, but it was the FBI, the FBN, and then Angleton and the CIA. Everybody was keeping Lansky from being investigated. So this is a part of what I think
that's really interesting, because if Bobby could have gotten that, he really would have been able to bust open a lot of that mob stuff in Vegas early. Yeah. Because I believe that when Hughes bought Las Vegas, if I'm remembering this correctly, he allowed that skim to continue.
Yeah, same people were running it.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that would have been really, really important to have broken that open, because they were taking a lot of money. A lot of money off the top, And
we really have no idea how the casinos would have been used to launder drug money, because that seems to be their main purpose. As much as the gambling was a thing in Cuba, it was I believe that its utility for laundering drug money is also as big as anything, and it probably is still the case today. And here's a kicker for you when you think about Mayhew and Rosselli and all this. When the CIA wanted to surveil and illegally and even plot the assassination of Julian Assange, do you know who they tasked for this?
No.
Sheldon Adelson, ultra-Zionist casino magnate of Las Vegas and Macau, and huge donor to political parties, funder of
You mean Miriam and Adelson's ex-husband?
Yeah, her widowed, her deceased husband.
Oh, okay.
So it's like the same Las Vegas casino murder incorporated things that they're doing in, in the 21st century.
By the way,
It's amazing.
when Hughes bought Las Vegas, okay, there's a very interesting scene. He's coming in from Boston on his train, okay, uh, going across the country, and it's Rosselli and Mayhew who are waiting for him in Vegas. All right, and it's Thanksgiving Day, and so they have turkey and dumplings on these plates. All right, and they're waiting for Hughes to come in, and so they hear the train whistle. All right, and they go ahead dispose of the plates and everything, and Hughes comes off the train, in his gurney. They're carrying him off the train, and he says, "Stop!" And he goes, "John?" And he goes, "Yeah, Howard. Uh, do you mind sticking around a couple of weeks? Because I think I'm going to have to be doing some business through you." And Rosselli goes, "Sure, Howard. No problem at all." Okay. And so here I think this is such an interesting scene. Here you have this mobster. You have at that time probably the richest guy in America. And then you have this CIA agent who was arranged for killings, Mayhew, this troika right in a very key moment in time when Howard Hughes is about to take over Las Vegas. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something about the power structure of the United States, I don't know what does. Okay. But it's right there with that little 3-person set, at the train station in Vegas, you know.
Right. I mean, it's when you think about Hughes and his strange, murky role, the fact that a lot of his money came from like CIA contracts and so on. In later years, but then he's so connected to the Las Vegas mob as well, and I believe his relationship to Lansky goes back to the 30s or 40s. I mean, it's the mob is a part of the regime. I mean, in the U.S., that's just a way to. I don't think there's any getting around this, and that's
See,
why the mafia, the people that are like the mafia did it. Like, I don't think they understand the
no,
mafia or the regime of the U.S.
the whole Hughes empire. Jim Hogan has written about this. Something happened in the Hughes empire, and I think it was 71 or 72, where there was a takeover. And I'm sure you're aware of this. Mayhew was unceremoniously, kicked out, literally thrown out of his own office. And the so-called Mormon mafia, all right, ended up taking over. And Hughes more or less disappeared from the scene after that.
And
And then,
people speculate whether he was even alive or not.
well, yeah, there is a lot of speculation about that. And it ended up being, and in fact, I think it was Peter who said this once. Okay. Uh, when you're investigating the Hughes empire, it's hard to determine where that ends and the CIA begins. Okay. Because the CIA ended up infiltrating so much of the Hughes empire afterwards. Okay. So it's a very, very interesting. And by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this. There was an utterly fascinating article in Playboy magazine. I'm thinking about 75 or 76. That was supposed to be a 2-part article, all right, about the CIA and the Hughes empire. The first part was so explosive, okay, as to exposing various CIA fronts in the Hughes empire that they didn't print the second part. It was supposed to run the next month and it didn't.
Yeah.
And so what happened was they then, I think 3 months later, they printed this whole fairy tale thing about the old eccentric Howard Hughes with a beard, okay, doesn't shave, doesn't wash, it's that whole thing that James Phelan put out, okay, which I believe was a cover story. All right. Something really happened at the magazine to stop them from running the second part of that story.
Or
All right.
something happened to make them run the first part of the story,
No,
because
no, the first part of the story was very accurate.
right, but I don't,
Okay.
but I have come to think that Watergate and what happens in the 70s there is a kind of warfare, sort of deep state warfare over who's going to control the clandestine apparatus. Like when Deep Throat is there talking to Woodward, and in this case, it's probably Alexander Haig. Woodward is a spook himself and not a very honest character. But in the book, they recount this part where he says everything is really on a knife's edge, and if this it's not even really about the burglars or anything like that. It's about the entire clandestine apparatus of the United States, and it's sprawling and it's horrific and all this, right? I mean, he's really, and people are going to start dying, right? He's making these statements, and I believe that they are kind of playing kind of brinksmanship and leaking stories to the press to blackmail other people. So if the article in Playboy is probably not merely an expose of the CIA from concerned citizens, but like but some element of this milieu trying to highlight what the CIA is doing, because a lot is at stake with, and so the more they could expose more spectacular things about what the government has been up to, and Hughes would be a big part of that in Vegas, and the way Vegas connects to the laundering of the drug money that the National Crime Syndicate, which is really an international crime syndicate, runs. I mean, I think that there's two bombs in the JFK case, I believe, that made it would not get investigated, right? Kostakov is the first one, which we'll come and talk about that in a second. But the other one is the personage of Jack Ruby, because he connects to things with the National Crime Syndicate that are like pivotal events: the takeover of the Teamster Pension Fund, that murder that he was in the room for, and then the James Reagan murder, which was written up by Drew Pearson, and even connected by Hoover in that article to very prominent figures like like Annenberg and the Crown family that had JFK sort of, or LBJ in deep water, at the time of the Kennedy assassination. So,
Well,
and then in the Watergate case, you have the bomb, meaning that you can't really investigate the burglars themselves.
the what you're talking about with the whole Ruby thing, you know, people talk. You mentioned Kostakov. All right,
Yeah,
if you go ahead and look at the Warren Commission report today, all right, 888 pages, and you take a look at what they did with Jack Ruby, all right, saying that there was no significant connection between Jack Ruby and organized crime. All right, well, significant is a pretty big word, okay? You know, I think going to Cuba and visiting Traficante, I think that's a significant connection. Okay. I think going to Cuba and visiting Louis McWillie, I think that's a pretty significant connection myself. All right. Now, now, if you're talking about an outline to the crime, here you have Oswald with all of these intelligence connections. Everywhere you look, and by the way, Richard Schweiker said this.
right.
Richard Schweiker. This isn't me. This is Richard Schweiker, who was a Republican senator from Pennsylvania. Okay. All right. On the church, while he was on the church committee, he himself said, everywhere you look with Oswald, you have the fingerprints of intelligence. And then you have Ruby. I mean, could you have any more of a connection between the CIA and organized crime than these two guys? Okay, and there you have it. And somehow the Warren Commission did one of the most excruciatingly evasive descriptions of these two men that you're ever going to see any place. And that David Bellin, if you remember David Bellin, he was on Nightline one night. I believe this was in the late 70s or something. And he said, I have seen every CIA document on the JFK case. All right. Can you imagine him saying that? That the CIA was going to show him every single document on the JFK case. The question I would have asked, well, then, why did you write such a horrible report on Oswald in Mexico City, Mr. Palin, if you had seen every single paper the CIA had on the JFK case? So here you had these two figures that screamed out, there's a connection here. And by the way, Bert Griffin and Leon Hubert, who were on the Ruby desk for the Warren Commission, Bert Griffin actually wrote a memo to this effect, okay, saying that if there's going to be a connection between Oswald and Ruby, it's most likely to come in the anti-Castro Cuban underground, okay, and they wanted permission to go ahead, which never came, of course, okay, to go ahead and investigate that nexus, all right? So it's not like they were completely unaware of it. They were aware of it, all right? But the higher-ups, people like Howard Willans, all right, who, by the way, is still around, all right, they did not give him permission and Hubert to go ahead and investigate that. The other point that Bert Griffin was onto was he did not think that Ruby came down the Main Street ramp. Okay. The official story is that on Sunday morning, a little bit after 11:17, Ruby goes ahead and he wires some money to little Lynn Carlin, one of his dancers at this club. And he just happens to wander over, which is about a block away, to the city hall, the basement, and he walks down the Main Street ramp, which had Officer Vaughn patrolling that ramp, who insisted the day he died that Ruby did not come down that ramp. All right. So the question then becomes, how did Ruby do this exquisite timing? And how did he get into the building? And not only did Griffin believe that Ruby did not come down that ramp, he also believed that Patrick Dean, who was in charge of security that day, was concealing how Ruby really did get in. Okay. See, Ruby was, if you take a look at Ruby's activities that weekend, this guy was walking around the police department like he was on the force. Okay.
Well, sometimes he was impersonating
right.
Like somebody who's going to be an interpreter for a Yiddish newspaper, something like that.
Yes, yes. Okay. On at the midnight conference that Wade held about Oswald,
right? You
can see a picture of Ruby. He has these glasses on. He has a tablet. He's sitting at a little, student desk with a pen in his hand. Okay. And he's impersonating like this just Jewish reporter. Okay. All right. Which, it's always almost funny. And then he is the guy who corrects Wade.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he says the Free Cuba Committee.
It's not the Free Cuba Committee. It's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Wasn't the Free Cuba Committee like the Guy Bannister thing?
No, it was Burke.
Admiral was Bannister a part of that?
No.
At some point,
no. That's a little different one.
Okay. I couldn't remember. I knew he had some crazy Cuban one.
He was associated with one, but it wasn't that one.
Yeah.
Okay. But
either way, it was a right wing thing, and then Ruby corrects him back there, pretending, and everybody in the Dallas police force knows him anyway, so they know he's not this pious, observant, Orthodox Jew or something like that. But he's still doing that. And he has a gun with him, by the way.
Yes, he did.
When he does this.
All 3 days.
Yeah.
All 3 days. And then he comes in on Saturday and he buys sandwiches for the officers, etc. And I think it's on that day that he actually wanted to go into Fritz's office when Oswald was there. All right. Then he hooks up this radio station, I think KLIF, all right, uh, with an interview with some of the police. And then the next morning, on Sunday morning, he's there at Dallas Police Headquarters at 9 o'clock in the morning, trying to find out when Oswald is going to be transferred. All right. And then, of course, comes the Western Union Telegraph Office, which, by the way, he arranged that. He could have given her the money the night before, but he said, I'll wire you the money tomorrow morning. Okay. Now, when I was running Probe Magazine, we had a writer who actually took a picture from the back of the Dallas Police Headquarters in City Hall to the Western Union Station. I never realized until that moment that it was a straight shot, that all somebody had to do was wave through the window to Ruby that he's coming down. It was that direct. All right. Okay. And I believe that's how Ruby was signaled. I believe that's how he got into the building.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I can believe that. I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, but for me, or what I've been more interested in is Ruby himself, because Max Arvo has written those articles on.
Oh, those extraordinary articles.
I feel like we know more. We have a clear picture of what they did, and the CIA was afraid of Ruby, and it's just amazing what he connects to with all the drug stuff. Like he functioned almost, I believe he functioned kind of like the bomb threat in a different way, because you can't investigate Ruby, because it wouldn't just unravel his role in the plot. It would unravel these huge arrangements with one of the most lucrative trades in the U.S., which is the drug trade, and which was protected by people like George White and Harry Anslinger and Hoover, essentially, and in collaboration with the crime syndicate. And that, I think, that's, I think, why they used Ruby. It's kind of horrifying when you think about it.
Max's articles, and I really can't recommend them enough. Okay, Max Arvo's articles about, I think it was a 2 or 3 part series.
Yeah, 3-part. Yeah.
Okay, and by the way, it was going to be even longer. Okay, the last installment was like 14,000 words. I said, Max, come on. Okay, you know how long it takes to read 14,000 words? Okay, it's like almost an hour.
It's a dense. These were dense.
So can we cut it down to under 10,000? Okay, so he got it down to 10,000. What he talked about there with Jolly West, okay, and the doctors in Dallas, part of that group, and what they did to Ruby by March of 1964. I thought that was simply outstanding.
Yeah.
That work he did on that. Because in my opinion, and I don't have to tell you, I've read a lot about this case. Okay, I was unaware of what the Dallas police did with that group of doctors in Dallas to go ahead and destabilize Ruby, and they did it so fast.
Well, I think they whatever psychological test they did are one thing, and who knows what all they were doing. But when West investigates him after Ruby has that episode, it seems to conform very close to a really terrible acid trip. And this is a guy who was known. I mean, that's what the guy's known for, is LSD. It's so straightforward, I think. And I believe it's not just before Ruby has a hearing, but it's also shortly before he meets with Warren. So they basically by giving him psychotropic drugs and evaluating him insane, they basically discredited him as a witness in general.
Right. That's exactly correct. But still, if you read the first meeting between the Warren Commission and Ruby. There were actually two, because the first one was the hearing for the Warren Commission. The second one was a polygraph test. All right. At the first meeting, he pleads with Warren, to be taken out of Dallas and interviewed in Washington. Okay. All right. And he basically says, and when I say this is almost a word for word description of what he said, because a whole new form of government is going to take over, and I won't be able to see you anymore. Okay. My life is in danger here. Why they didn't take him back just to satisfy that plea. Okay. If Ruby had something to say, he didn't want to say it in Dallas because he felt that it was a dangerous ground. I think that's really unconscionable, that they didn't do that.
Yeah, I think that Warren is there, and he already knows or has surmised that Ruby is an underworld figure. And he's also been told himself that if you unravel the conspiracy, it'll lead to the Soviets in a nuclear bomb. He probably knew some of the details of why they were making that argument, even though, as you say, or as you found, Kostakov, that story of Oswald visiting a Soviet assassin in Mexico City was likely fabricated, probably from Angleton's office, I would guess. But at any rate, Warren had been told that it would lead to nuclear war if you unraveled this conspiracy. Ruby, even though Ruby seems to be clearly a conspiratorial actor, Warren already has in his mind that he must cover up any sort of conspiracy. And
Yes.
if Warren started to have doubts about whether the Soviet part was really true, that would also make him instantly recognize the power of the plotters to put Ruby in that position and to put him, the Chief Justice of the United States, in the position of covering it up. And he probably would have surmised that this isn't, whatever this is not something I can. Because as you say, it's unconscionable to not take Ruby back there. And Warren knew that he needed to cover up any conspiracy that he found because the world might end. So that's the position that he's in when he hears Ruby saying all these things. Like, if Ruby is pointing to some darker conspiracy, that could have scared Warren almost as much as the nuclear angle.
Well, the problem is, and I don't know if you know this, you probably do, Dorothy Kilgallen published it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Eventually, yeah. What year did she publish it?
I don't know where she got it, but
nobody does. Nobody totally does.
Before the Warren Report came out.
Right. And the fact that she got it is very interesting.
Well, it's more than interesting. It's pretty compelling. Who the heck gave it to her?
And why?
Yeah. Okay. And so this in itself created a controversy. And then when the Ruby trial goes on, she's down there and she has these two very short conferences with Jack Ruby, which nobody knows what was said. Maybe nothing was said. Okay. But we know that we never found out what was said. Yep. And we also know that Ruby wanted to talk to her. So this created a really strange, ambience about, Ruby and the trial and his pleas to get out of Dallas, etc., which never went away. They never went away. What exactly was Ruby so worried about? See, that's something we're never going to know, okay? Because of the fact that he didn't take him back. Now, as you say, most of the people listening to your show understand that Johnson put the fear of God into Earl Warren, when he convinced him to take the job, because he had McNamara prepare those charts of how many people would perish in a first strike. Okay. I think it was like 40 million or something. All right. And so that evidently moved Warren to tears. Okay. And he was, for all intents and purposes, Warren was kind of neutered Okay, by the way, I'm not exaggerating that either, because if you take a look at the first meeting of the Warren Commission, Warren doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to hire private investigators. He doesn't even want to have any public hearings. He doesn't even want to call any witnesses. He just wants to rely on the FBI reports. Okay, that's how much that Johnson put the fear of God into Earl Warren. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
The only
And Warren is
reason,
an establishment man. Above all else, you do
yes,
not get to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice if you are not receptive to power. He wasn't a crusader for, I don't believe he was a
well,
crusader for
yes, well,
racial
in one sense he
justice.
was, because of the Brown versus Board decision.
Right, but let
Okay,
me let me let me suggest that if you ever read the book Cold War Civil Rights, it's by I think Mary Dujak is her name, and she points out that even people like John Foster Dulles and so on were in favor of civil rights in the U.S. because for Cold War purposes, the U.S. looked so bad because of this. People were showing that we
mm-hmm.
charged genocide report to American diplomats. You know, the one that Paul Robeson tried to champion, and they wanted to present to the UN to complain about the plight of black people in the U.S. And they needed, so the Jim Crow was a albatross around the U.S. But because of the structure of Congress and the filibuster and all this, you couldn't really get rid of you can get rid of Jim Crow. You couldn't desegregate schools and so on. I think that is why the establishment got an establishment guy, Earl Warren, to do these things, because it was the only way you could really handle it at that point or make progress in that way was using the judiciary. I don't think that I don't think Warren necessarily, I think he took cues from people in the establishment that like this was the thing to do. I would
Well,
guess. And
but
in the
wait a
war and
minute.
with the Warren report, he definitely does that.
Well, Eisenhower told him not to vote for Brown versus Board.
Was that what I mean, that's interesting if true, but I would there could have been
No,
other countervailing.
it is true. Eisenhower
Okay.
did advise him not to vote for the Brown versus Board decision.
Yeah.
So whatever his motivation was,
Yeah.
okay, that is something he did.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay,
he's
that
known for that for
right.
absolutely.
But as far as the rest of his career, okay, from what I understand, he was seriously entertained by Dewey as being part of the ticket, against Truman. All right, in what was that, 1948?
Yeah.
All right. So the other thing that Warren is famous for, of course, is for defendants' rights, which makes what he did in the Warren Commission so incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, because here's a guy who was for defendants' rights, and here he is depriving Oswald of every possible right he could have. All right. I mean, imagine this. Mark Lane.
And Ruby, if you really want to think about it.
Mar- well, if you read the Ruby thing, the first hearing, Ruby was not happy with Tannehill, one of his lawyers. He even wanted him to leave the room, okay, during that interrogation. All right. So that's a different matter, which I'll address a little bit later. But Mark Lane wrote to the Warren Commission, J. Lee Rankin, saying that he had been solicited by Oswald's mother to represent Oswald's interests before the commission. All right. And he was asking permission to go ahead and do such a thing. Rankin wrote him back. This is actually exquisite when you think about it. Mr. Lane, we are going to be in possession of highly classified information from the FBI. All right. And therefore, we are going to have to turn down your request to represent Mr. Oswald's interests before the commission. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that being the reason that he turned down Mark Lane's request? And then, of course, the actual hearings were closed. The only hearing that was open was Mark Lane, because he insisted, or else he wasn't going to testify. Okay. That was the only hearing that was open to the public. All right. So all of this secrecy in both the documentation and the hearings, all right, was purposely designed, okay, so that we couldn't really understand what was happening. And then, of course, 2 months after the report comes out, then you get 26 volumes of evidence. All right. And the whole thing about the 26 volumes is that what was left out was more interesting than what was in. Okay. Same thing with the House Select Committee. What was left out was much more interesting and compelling than what was in the I think it was 12 volumes for the House Select Committee. Now, Jack Ruby, as you said, I mean, it's utterly amazing that the commission never explored Jack Ruby to any kind of, deep or wide or trying to get into the nooks and crannies of this guy's life, because as many writers have said, and it's not just me, Jack Ruby was a man for all seasons. He was the perfect guy. Here's a guy who was an FBI informant, was involved in CIA gun running out of this little town called Kima, Texas.
FBN informant too.
Yes, right. That's exactly correct. All right. And was really, he might as well have been on the police force. Okay. Because he had all of these police guys. He was passing out free passes to his club.
Yeah.
At police headquarters. And he was plying them with free drinks, with free food, and his girls. Okay. And then, of course, what I left for last, of course, was the fact that he was a low-level mob asset. And it wasn't just in Dallas. Okay. Chicago, Dallas, New Orleans, to Florida. He's
Los Angeles. He has Los Angeles connections with people like Mickey Cohen, and he worked at the Santa Anita racetrack.
Well, that the most interesting thing I thought was the whole thing about him going down to Cuba when Trafficante was in detention.
Yeah.
And according to one reliable witness, he actually talked to Trafficante. Now, why is that so interesting? Because Trafficante was one of the three mobsters that the CIA recruited to do away with Fidel Castro. The other two being Rosselli and Giancana. And so, some kind of cosmic irony, Jack Ruby is talking to this guy who's going to be enlisted by the CIA to kill Castro. And then, of course, the denouement to this, which is almost like out of a Shakespearean drama, all right, come the church committee, come the House Select Committee, Giancana is shot in his house. Nobody ever figured out, okay, who
he
went
was
ahead.
under police, like the police were around him. They were like, he wasn't in custody, but he was.
They were called off. There was a police car outside of his house.
Yeah.
But it wasn't there when the killer went in. All right. And then Rosselli. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Then Rosselli ends up in an oil barrel down in Florida. All right. And most people who investigated Rosselli's death believe that it was Trafficante, because Trafficante was the last guy standing. Okay, out of those three people.
But Lansky, Lansky is the one. And Lansky in 1970, it's reported that he steps down. This is when Nixon starts investigating Lansky, because Lansky never gets indicted until 1970, post-war era, right? And he goes and hides in Israel, and he stays there until it's safe to come back, which he does in 1973. But it's written about in, I think that Peter has written about this, maybe Alfred McCoy, and this other Danish journalist named Kruger, who wrote The Great Heroin Coup, that Trafficante seems to have taken over the role played by Lansky after 1970. And it's so, to my mind, what is interesting is the U.S. takes step to indicts Lansky, and the IRS starts investigating. He flees to Israel. He doesn't come back until Watergate is this crisis, and then the government can't do much about him. But whatever, Watergate unfolds the way it does. Trafficante is actually not indicted until 1986, and then he dies I believe in 87, and Iran-Contra, happens in the wake of all this. So there are drug things going through all of these that I don't have a perfect theory to explain, but they are interesting. As you say, Trafficante, who was initially, thanks to his father, really tied to Lansky and Lansky's Cuban business. Like, that's how he
Right.
was the perfect person to
Right.
do this. But the two guys that do survive this are Lansky and Trafficante. And the interesting thing is, when they make the Hollywood mythologized version, they have a character who's like Lansky, Hyman Roth, and he is saying he's
Oh,
going to
you
go
mean in The
flee
Godfather?
yeah, in the
Yeah.
Godfather version, they say he's going to go hide in Israel, but then he gets shot at the airport and he dies, right? But that's not what happens at all. It's all the Italian guys who get knocked off,
Right.
and Jimmy Hoffa and Jimmy Hoffa. So
Right.
meanwhile, the two guys who ran the whole drug thing, apparently the national international syndicate, are the guys who survived that era.
Yeah.
Lansky
It's
lives to a
very,
ripe old age.
yeah. It's very, very interesting. See, coming from Florida, okay, which is where I think Tampa was Trafficante's base of operations. Okay, when Lansky leaves, he would be the perfect guy to go in there and take over what interests there were still left, which there wasn't much in Cuba at that time because Castro had really stamped out everything. All right, but Florida was a very good entry point.
And
Okay,
Caribbean banks too. Castle
yes,
Bank.
right. It was a very good center for drugs and money, and washing money, et cetera, and all that stuff. You know, uh, Lansky, but I don't know if you know this, but Lansky was the guy that Jim Garrison was so suspicious of. Okay. There was a story in New Orleans Magazine around 75 when the church committee was investigating. Okay. And he said, to him, the Kennedy assassination was triangular between the CIA, the Cuban exiles, and organized crime. And he said the Lansky wing, he actually said that, the
Yeah.
Lansky wing of
Yeah.
organized crime. Okay. And I think he also said Trafficante in that interview. Okay. All right. Meaning that whole Cuban Florida nexus. All right. So this is also very interesting because, you know, uh, if you take a look at the Warren Commission, all right, the Warren Commission never explored any of this stuff. Now, the House Select Committee.
Yeah, but they still don't. They still go with the Italian thing.
Okay, I was just going to say that. See, the House Select Committee, if you take a look at, they devoted a whole volume to this. All right. I can't remember what volume it was, but it was really sort of like a conventional view of organized crime.
Like the J. Edgar Hoover view.
Yeah, it
which was
was.
not
Well, okay,
Bobby
yeah, that's
Kennedy's.
one way to explain it.
Well,
Okay.
the eventual J. Edgar Hoover thing, he denied it. The FBN first said, "Oh yeah, yeah, mafia," and then finally, I think after the Appalachian thing, then finally Hoover has to say, "Yeah, this La Cosa Nostra thing, it exists."
Well, definitely after the Valachi tapes. Okay, he had to, he had to admit that. Okay, but it was this conventional, almost TV version out of the Untouchables.
Yeah,
Okay, that
right.
the House Select Committee was presenting, and I can't remember the guy out of New York City that Blakey used, um, but that was his view because that's where he was coming from. That was organized crime in New York City. Okay. It wasn't organized crime. So, if you spread out a little bit and go to Las Vegas and go to Florida and go to France, it was much, much more different. All right. But that was the view that the House Select Committee took, and I believe, and a lot of other people think, that that was the wrong view, you know, to take of as far as the Kennedy assassination went. It was a much more diverse, much more complex picture
Yeah.
that evidently this guy from New York did not want to take. Whether that was planned or not is, that's a different question.
Right. Yeah, the organized crime angle is key, and the National Wire Service and the Teamsters. This was never really sorted out, and it had to have been bigger than Hoffa because of how Hoffa ends up getting killed. I mean, to me, that says
Well, if I
that's a
remember that
fascinating
correctly,
thing.
if I remember correctly, Annenberg ran the biggest Daily Wire kind of paper.
He
Okay.
did, and for a while he had the National Wire Service itself, but I think it kind of gets rolled into his like sort of legit magazine thing that ends up doing maybe similar, basically what the Wire Service did, but they disband it because in the 50s. At some point in the 50s, they get rid of the Wire Service, but for a while it was there, and it did help to consolidate organized crime's hold over law
Mhm.
enforcement around the country because you could corrupt local law enforcement with the Wire Service. You just get people taking little bribes for gambling, and then you can corrupt the whole law enforcement. That seems
Didn't
to be.
organized crime take it over? Didn't Annenberg got in trouble? Okay, with the authorities. All right, and I actually think he was sentenced.
Well,
All right.
the father Annenberg, who was an
Yes, that's
associate
what I'm
of, who
talking
was a
about.
close associate of Lansky, and he goes to jail in the 30s. But this younger one is the one that sets up TV Guide and everything else, and becomes one of
Right.
this oligarch family that owns newspapers and Racing Wire, the biggest racing magazine, like the kind of
Hmm.
monopoly racing magazine, basically. And he was mentioned when James Reagan said, "Yeah, these guys in Chicago are trying to kill me." Hoover told Drew Pearson that this was connected to Henry Crown and Annenberg, and
Right. Right.
maybe the Hilton guys too, if I remember. So it was like this whole group of people that are involved in this, and they're elite. They're oligarch figures. I mean, Crown
Mhm.
it owns that military company, and he's also intertwined with the Chicago outfit. And
Mhm.
this is the level of corruption at the top here with the underworld and these important oligarchs.
Now, getting back to the other subject that you wanted to talk about, uh, which I believe was Kostakov.
Yeah,
All right.
and we can leave there because we've gone on a bit. So, but after let's talk about Kostakov because that is fascinating. But I don't want to keep you too long.
If you read through the Warren Commission, see, the Warren Commission on Mexico City is really in a fog because they were not allowed to really divulge their sources. Okay. And so it's kind of like a a spin dry thing. Oswald did this. Okay. Oswald did this. Okay. Oswald did this. And there's really never any backing. There's just a lot of assumptions for what Oswald was doing in Mexico City. And this was deliberate because when the Warren Commission went down to Mexico City, they were given the cold shoulder, all right, by the Department of Interior at Chavarria, who had been placed in charge of Oswald in Mexico City, all right? And they were not even allowed to talk to Sylvia Duran, which says a lot because nobody had more interaction with whoever Oswald was down there, okay, than Sylvia Duran did, all right? So what happened was that they ended up saying that, well, okay, this is the story. Oswald goes to Mexico City to get an in-transit visa through Cuba to the Soviet Union. All right. Now, as many people have said, he really didn't have to do that. Okay. All he had to do was go ahead and mail it in, you know, which is how he got his first passport, go to some, you know, nearby embassy and get it done there. He didn't have to do all this. All right. Very strange. Okay. But he did. At least that's what the Warren Commission says he did. All right. Well, the fact that he did it this way meant that this gave the pretext to go to both the Cuban embassy and the Russian embassy. And the Warren Commission tells us that he met with this guy, Valery Kostakov, who was a KGB agent undercover at the Russian embassy. Now, Oswald didn't get what he went there for. All right. He didn't get the so-called in-transit visa because it takes weeks to get approved for that, which is hard to believe that he didn't know that. All right. So he goes back by bus to Dallas. And then on the day of the assassination, all this stuff about Oswald in Mexico City comes out. All right. But on top of that, it now is claimed that Kostakov was not just a Soviet diplomat, he was actually part of Department 13, which the story at that time was that they were in charge of liquidations in the Western Hemisphere for the KGB. So the obvious story then becomes Oswald assassinated Kennedy because he was in the employ of the KGB for Moscow. And by the way, let me add a very important point. This is exactly what the KGB told Richard Case Nagel when they hired him I believe in August. They said, look, we have information that there's a plot to kill Kennedy. All right. And we believe that the end game of the plot is to blame Moscow for the assassination. So we need you to track down this plot and abort it before it happens. Okay. Which is exactly what happened. Okay. That's what happened. So what happens is that the Warren Commission prints this in their volumes. This whole story about Kostakov and Department 13. One of the recently declassified documents made under Trump's executive order is a 1971 CIA memo that states we have no credible information that Kostakov was a part of Department 13. All right. Which I put this in my article. It's called Nothing Burgers. Nope. Okay. All right. Because the New York Times and all these other mainstream are trying to say there's nothing new in any of these documents coming out. All right. Well, that's new. All right. If Kostakov was not part of Department 13, or if that was a disinformation story, then you have to wonder why and who put that story out there in the first place. And was it planned to do such a thing? Because the more and more we learn about Mexico City, the more and more questions we have. I mean, whether or not Oswald ever went to Mexico City is an open question. Whether or not he did the things he was told, we were told by the Warren Commission he did, is another open question. And the reason for that, of course, is because of the Lopez report. All right. I'm sure you've talked about this before, but in case any of your viewers don't know what that is, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was tasked with doing a study of Oswald in Mexico City. The two guys who did it are Dan Hardaway and Ed Lopez. These were both students of Robert Blakey's from Cornell, right? They spent months investigating Oswald in Mexico City. And they talked to people that the Warren Commission didn't even know existed. Because if you look in the 17,000 pages of the Warren Commission volumes, you will not see David Phillips or Ann Goodpasture in the volumes. They talked to both. They even talked to the translators who did the translations of the Russian and Spanish tapes, because the CIA, of course, had both embassies bugged. All right. They talked to, I think, 7 people in Mexico City who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Their report was not published in the House Select Committee volumes, 350 pages, including footnotes. I asked Eddie Lopez, why was your report not published in the House Select Committee volumes? He said, Jim, the day we went in to meet with the CIA team, because they had the last word on what was going to get into the volumes, they objected to every single sentence in the opening part of the report. It took us 8 hours to get through the first 2 pages. Now, if you figure it's 350 pages long, they would have been there for 7 months. Okay. And so Blakey threw in the towel. Now, let me explain why what I just said is so important. The opening pages of the Lopez report deal with something called the pulse camera. The pulse camera was a super advanced camera that the CIA had created. It was so sensitive that a disturbance in the air current would activate the camera to take a picture. What does that mean? That means this. Anytime the door opened and closed, it would activate the camera. Now, why is that important? because the CIA should have had 10 pictures of Oswald entering and exiting the Cuban consulate, entering and exiting the Russian consulate. They have 0. They have never,
except for the weird picture, right? Or of some
well,
strange
I don't
guy.
even want to talk about that. That's so stupid. Oh, well, we can talk about that because it's an interesting story behind that. But in all the intervening years, and what are we on now? 62, 63 years. They've never been able to come up with a picture of Oswald. And by the way, we now have the cable in which the guy down in Mexico City says literally something to the effect, no picture. Okay? All right. Now, if that isn't suspicious enough, the night of the assassination, the CIA sent what they said was a tape of Oswald because they not only have camera coverage, they have sound coverage. All right. And they send it up to Dallas Fort Worth because the FBI is interviewing Oswald. All right. Hoover writes a memo saying, my agents who are interviewing Oswald in Dallas have listened to this tape, and this is not Oswald's voice on the tape. Now, if that's not bad enough, how about this? This transcriber said that Oswald spoke very bad Russian, but very good Spanish. Now, Aaron, anybody who has studied JFK Assassination 101 knows that it should have been the opposite, that Oswald spoke very good Russian. And by the way, this was before he left for the Soviet Union, because we know that Rosalind Quinn, who was studying for a position in the State Department, was taking a class in Russian. She had a private tutor for over a year. She went out with Oswald for this purpose. She said he spoke better Russian than I did. Okay. So this is before he leaves.
Right.
So he's been in the Soviet Union for 2 years. His Russian could only have gotten better. And in fact, Titovitz, his best friend in Minsk, I talked to him at a conference in 2014 in Washington, and I asked him this question. He said he spoke very good Russian. All right. How on earth, then, could this guy speak very bad Russian and very good Spanish? Because all the evidence says it should have been the opposite. All right. Then the CIA is getting frantic because they can't figure out how Oswald got down there. I mean, you know how desperate they got? They went to private airfields and said, did Oswald come in on a private? Because they can't figure out how he got there. All right. They sent a CIA guy over to the Cuban embassy because there were 2 CIA plants in the Cuban embassy. And they showed him a picture of Oswald. Did you ever see this guy in the embassy? And they go, no, never saw him. They got desperate. A week later, they go back. They say, please, did you ever see this guy in the embassy? And they go, no, we never saw him here. Okay. Now, with that kind of information, you can see why the CIA was not ever going to let the Lopez report out. Okay. You know, finally, because of Oliver Stone and JFK and the ARB, they finally had to declassify because see, the Lopez report had become legendary. in the intervening years between 1979 and 1991-92 when the Stone movie came out. All right. And so because Danny and Eddie would talk about it, okay, and it got into some books that there were all these gaps in the CIA story. Now here's the capper. Danny and Eddie were so suspicious of what Ann Goodpasture and David Phillips was telling them. They wrote up a bill of indictment for both of them for perjury. Because getting back to this mystery man photo that you brought up earlier, this is a photo that the CIA sent up that was supposed to be of Oswald in Mexico City. It doesn't look anything like Oswald in Mexico City. The guy has like a crew cut. He looks like he should be playing rugby. Okay, big husky guy. You know, Oswald weighed about 145 pounds on a good day. All right. And it became known as a mystery man photo. When Danny and Eddie investigated this, they found out that Goodpasture had moved over the date where this guy was outside. I believe it was the Soviet consulate. Okay. Because she was so hard up to get a white Caucasian fellow there, all right, in Mexico City that would pass at least an excuse for Oswald being there. This is one of the grounds on which they were going to base their indictment. All right. All right. And so this is Danny and Eddie said that when they first started their investigation, they really didn't suspect they were going to find anything. And then they said, we felt that way until the moment we met Ann Goodpasture. This is another thing that and we can close the show out on this. This is another thing that Ann Goodpasture told them. They wanted to know who had the first take on the photographic coverage of the embassies there. All right. And Ann Goodpasture said she didn't know. But you might want to talk to this guy or this guy or this guy. So they talked to about 5 or 6 people. And then they got down to the bottom guy in the list. And the bottom guy in the list said, wait a minute. Ann Goodpasture had the first take on the photographic coverage of the embassies. So she had sent them on a wild goose chase, knowing that it was her. So this is what got them very, very suspicious about both Goodpasture and the fact that their information was that when Phillips was away from his desk, because he had a desk in Mexico City, because he would be flying around to JM Wave and Langley, she took care of his operations when he was gone. Okay. Final punchline. In one of the most interesting parts of the Lopez report, it says that it took 8 days for the Kostakov memo to get to Langley. Let me say that again. It took 8 days for the Kostakov memo to get to Langley. Here you have a former Soviet defector meeting with a KGB operative undercover. Okay. And it take 8 days for that to get to Langley. Phillips made up this excuse that he had to clear the memo. Okay. It turned out Phillips did no such thing because he wasn't even there at the time. Okay. And this is another one of the things that made them so suspicious that Phillips and Goodpasture were in cahoots about this masquerade about Oswald in Mexico City. All right. Now, it's come to this point today that because of all of these diversions, all of these, I mean, let's be frank, all these deceptions, okay, that there's some people like David Josephs who did a very good job on this for Kennedy's and King, they highly suspect that Oswald wasn't even there, okay, or if he was there, he did not do the things that the CIA said he did. And if that is the case, it is very strongly indicative that there was a conspiracy afoot 7 weeks before the assassination.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. I can't do much better than that.
Right. I think that is quite reasonable. The only one thing that I would, and you may be able to answer this here, didn't Richard Case Nagel meet with Oswald in Mexico City? Wasn't
that's his story?
So wouldn't that make sense for Oswald?
No.
If Oswald went to Mexico City, couldn't that have been part of the reason? A fair play for Cuba thing? Yeah.
Aaron, that's a different time frame.
Okay.
Okay. He says he went earlier. Okay. Then when I think Oswald left September 29th or something like that. Okay. 28th or something like that. And then he came back, I think, on October 3rd. Nagel says it was early September. They went down there in early September. All right.
And what was his story? That he went there with Oswald, or that he met Oswald there?
No, I think he said that he met Oswald there. Okay.
Right.
But don't hold me to that. I'd have to brush up on that. Okay.
Yeah. Because that actually makes, I mean, the fact that Nagel had that fair play for Cuba literature beforehand, the fact that Jack Ruby's so quick to point that out. I mean, the guy Bannister angled to the fair play for Cuba thing, and Bannister's status as an ex-FBI guy.
Jim Garrison always said that Richard Case Nagel was the most important witness that there was. And you know how important he was? Before the Clay Shaw trial, they threw a hand grenade at him in New York. Okay. Yeah. He brings the remnants of the hand grenade back to Garrison, and he says, I don't think it's going to be a good idea to have me testify for you. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, New York has crime, but it's typically not grenade crime, right? Okay. Well, Jim, where can people find your work? And is there anything else we should know about in the coming weeks, months, about how things are going to move forward with this JFK disclosure movement now?
All right. About my work, kennedysandking.com is my website. And we put up articles there at least once a week, sometimes more often. All right. Reviews, analysis. We have some very distinguished writers. Okay. My Substack is under James Anthony DiEugenio. All right. And that's where you'll see my story about Jim and Oliver meet the Luna Committee. All right. My latest book, if I can get a plug-in for that, okay, is this. The JFK assassination chokeholds. All right. And the inescapable proof there was a conspiracy is a subtitle. I'm a contributor to this book. Okay. I wrote 2 essays and the conclusion. The other contributors are people like Paul Blow and Matt Crumpton, Andrew Eiler, and Mark Adamczyk. Now, as far as your question about, oh yeah, I wrote the script for JFK Revisited and the long version, the 4-hour version, JFK Destiny Betrayed. The question you just asked about what's going to happen to the Luna Committee, that's a very interesting question. Okay. I don't know if they're going to call any more witnesses. I do know this, that first hearing was very successful in the sense that it got a lot of attention. All right. But I don't know what the follow-up is going to be. I wrote a memo to Jake, okay, the guy that me and Oliver met outside the Rayburn building, telling him who some of the people they should interview as a follow-up. You know, there's 3 ways they do interviews. They do the public hearing, which you saw. They do formal depositions under oath. And they do informal interviews. Okay. And so I suggested a list of people they should talk to. And this included John Thunheim, who was the chairman of the ARB. I included Robert Blakey. I included Gary Cornwell of the House Select Committee. And I also included Danny Hardway and Eddie Lopez as the people they should talk to about secret files and documents, etc., that they might be able to get their hands on. All right. During the committee hearing at the end, I mentioned that there had been 3 attempts on JFK's life in November. There was the one in Chicago. There was one in Tampa. There was a successful one in Dallas. And I said the one in Chicago so closely resembled the successful one in Dallas that if that information would have been provided to Secret Service headquarters, I think the Dallas attempt would have been thwarted. Okay. This is one of the things I think they should try and get, because the ARB, in their report, they said the records of the Secret Service in the fall of 1963 were not available to us for whatever reason. They actually thought they were destroyed. All right. Now, the one in Tampa, I'm sure you're aware of this. The fall guy for that one was supposed to be Gilberto Lopez. Gilberto Lopez actually attended a Fair Play for Cuba Committee meeting. He then left Tampa, went to Texas, went to Mexico City, and was the only passenger on a flight from Mexico City to Havana. Now, if that is not suspicious, I don't know what the heck is. Okay. But even the House Select Committee said it was certainly extraordinary that the Warren Commission did not investigate Gilberto Lopez more closely. And so I've come to the conclusion Kennedy was not getting out of 1963 alive. Okay. That was my conclusion about those 3 instances. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Aaron.
I agree with you there. His assassination was overdetermined. And
yes,
this tells us a lot about the system that we have and why it's in such a shambles today.
Right.
So, Jim, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for speaking with us today. I'm really happy that you've gotten some more publicity for your efforts. I hope it continues. And I hope that, as bad as it is that this empire is crumbling, maybe this will be the catalyst for disclosing some of these things, because it was the empire that I would say, in a sense, killed Kennedy. And now that whole enterprise is failing, and I don't see how it's going to be revived. These guys can't go on ruling the world. They're going to have to do what JFK tried to do, which is find a way to exist basically peacefully and not as the great policeman of the dollar and everything else, So I'm optimistic that if we don't blow up the world, maybe we will get some disclosure and truth here. So
It's
thank
like
you.
a race. It's a race between the two objects.
I
Okay.
agree. Yeah, I agree. So, and Kennedy must have felt like that when he was in office, given what the military wanted to do with all those nukes. So, maybe if we can defuse this thing without blowing up the world, it'll be a great thing. So, thanks for your efforts in this, and I'll talk to you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Check out the show notes for links to Jim DiEugenio's Kennedys and King website and to his new book, Chokeholds, or the JFK Assassination Chokeholds That Prove There Was a Conspiracy. Jim has heroically labored on this case for decades. I hope that we can soon see him vindicated spectacularly as more and more of the true facts of the case are brought to light. Let's hope that the truth can destroy the devil's chessboard.